we have in front of us is the original Generative Fill straight out of Adobe Photoshop. I ran it through this program called Magnific that's supposed to upscale things and make them more detailed. Let's see if it did a decent job. Okay, move the slider. Oh my good gosh, look at what? Could you imagine if Adobe's Generative Fill ever got to this point? Wow. If anything, I think we can still use this. Let's jump into Photoshop and I'll show you how. If you've watched my YouTube channel within the last 6 or 7 months, you probably know my thoughts on Adobe's Generative Fill. I love that we can type anything we want and it appears on our canvas. What I loathe is the fact that we're stuck to 1024 by 1024. The Generative Fill, it just doesn't fit in most of my compositions because my images are too high resolution. If I was using a cell phone camera or maybe even a 20 megapixel camera, it might be fine. But using any camera with 50 plus megapixels and this Generative Fill is just not going to work. Until now. So in the past, I've done some videos teaching you how you can take Generative Fill, maybe add a little bit of noise and sharpen them up a little bit. But there's a new tool I'm using called Magnific that is going to take the Generative Fill that we do in Photoshop and make it look fantastic. So let me walk you through this image. So this is the finished piece that I have here. And it actually started off looking like this. When me and my friends were on our workshop shooting towards this location, we did not like the fact that this building looked very modern. But it didn't stop me from photographing it because I knew if I wanted to, I can always add a log cabin to it, right? So that's exactly what I did. I added this beautiful little cabin here and it looks perfect in this space. But it didn't start out this way. So let's talk about how I did this. I'll walk you through the entire process so you can use Magnific on your high-res images as well when you're using Generative Fill in Photoshop. So the first thing we need to do is essentially fill this space in here, okay? So I'm just gonna get my remove tool. I basically need to build a platform for this because if I were to make a selection for this, it's the exact same shape and size as this, then when I tell Generative Fill to make it, it's going to put maybe a cabin here and then maybe a person here or maybe an outbuilding or something like that or multiple cabins. I want one cabin. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take the remove tool and I'm gonna go throughout this whole area here, this whole space right here, and just remove this whole cabin. Okay, I don't even want to use this as a base to start. Press enter, commit to it, and there we go. We are off to the races. We got nothing there now. We got a nice plateau here though where we can build that. So let's do this. Let's grab our polygonal lasso tool because I'm making a building. And I'm going to go ahead and just start at the bottom, click here, move up, and kind of just make this the shape of a building. It doesn't have to be perfect because, you know, Generative Fill is going to do what it wants to do anyway, but just something that is not just a straight rectangle. So now in the Generative Fill dialog here, I'm going to type a rustic log cabin. So now we certainly have a log cabin here. This is some rustic looking log cabins. I think of the 3 of these, I think I like this one the most. So if I zoom out here, that's not too bad. We don't have really a front door facing us or anything. Let's do one more generation and see if it makes anything better. All right, so out of these cabins, you know, I think I like that one the best. Let's go with this one. It's got a little bit more character to it. Looks like someone took a little bit of more effort and time in creating that beautiful log cabin home. So we'll use this. Now we zoom in here and we look at this log cabin. It looks dilapidated, doesn't it? It looks like it's a little beat up. It even looks like the roof is just kind of like slumped in from maybe being rained on too much with these natural materials just withering away. I don't really like what has happened here with Adobe's Generative Fill. So I'm just going to make a stamp of all of this. I'm going to press Control, Shift, Alt, and E, which will stamp my entire document. Then I'm going to make a marquee selection here, just like this, and just go right over this building, just like this, okay? And then I'll press Command or Control J, just to duplicate that and put it on its own layer. That way I have everything here in its own layer, and when I turn this on and off, it won't look any different until we do that, okay? Because I have this building here, I'm going to press Control and just click on here. That will make a selection for that whole area. Now I'm going to press Control C, then Control N for a new document, and then Control V to paste it. Now with this, I'm just going to Control Shift E and just stamp it down, flatten it down, and then save it. Go File, Save As. I'm just going to save this into this area here. We're going to call this cabin. All right. And now I need to open Magnific, which is actually in my web browser. So as you can see here, this is going to show all the renderings I've done. I'm going to give you a little idea of how this works. Essentially what this is it's an upscaler and detailer for your images. In the past images that I ran through here, this was another cabin that I had generated. Look at the amount of detail that we get in that cabin. Now for this technique, I'm not too concerned if it generates anything weird outside of the cabin, as long as it's the cabin. But even look at just the trees, they look absolutely beautiful. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop the image I have, which is that cabin image, into this space here. Now, I'm going to set this for nature and landscapes, and I have the original prompt that I used in Adobe's Generative Fill here. Now, you have 3 sliders here that you can use to make this actually operate. You have your creativity slider, you have a HDR slider, and you have a resemblance slider. The creativity slider is how much liberty or freedom you want to give the program to create. So let's move this up just a little bit. You just give it 2. HDR is, do we want any height and dynamic range? I do not for this. And then resemblance, how close do we want it to look to the original cabin? If we bring this all the way up, it'll just detail it really nicely, but it won't do too much outside of it. So let's actually go maybe 1 or 2 on the opposite direction. The engine, I always just set to automatic. It's going to tell me here that the final size is going to be 2246 by 1278. So it's going to be upscaling while it details it. And it's going to cost me 5 coins here. Now, this is a paid program. I have paid for a year, prepaid for a year. So as my generations go down, you're going to see this 29,000 generations go down more and more. But I think it'd be kind of hard for me to use 29,000 at 5 coins at a time. Let's let it do its generation, and we'll see what happens if we do something with the creativity resemblance in a second here. All right, here we go. Look at that. Now, what it did was it just took that really bad looking, dilapidated generated building and actually made it look like a log cabin. Even right here, you can see where the logs are starting to meet instead of it just being a gray line. You can see our window has much better window treatment on them. This actually looks like a door that could go in and out of the building. It's pretty good, okay? It takes about 60 seconds for this to render. This is probably what I'm going to end up using in the image, but let's see what happens if we let this be really creative and make it not resemble this at all, and just see what happens. All right, let's see what creative did here. Now, when we let it go really creative and have the resemblance a little further down, you can see that it made a much more beautiful looking cabin here. Now this one still has this old rustic look to it, whereas this one actually feels like someone might be living there. I think that, you know, we could probably get away with maybe even using this one. There are some things in here that are a little messed up that I might have to clone out in Photoshop, but if we want it to look like it's something that's lived in, I think this is the direction we are going to want to go. So now all I need to do here is download this image and I'm ready to go. So I'll press the download button here. So let's hop back into Photoshop and we'll get this guy all cleaned up. All right, so we can close this. We don't necessarily need that. Right here, what you're going to see on this image, this is the one that we're working on, that we want to change this cabin. What I'm going to do is I'm going to press Command or Control D to deselect this, and then right click on this and say Convert to Smart Object. Now, after I convert this to a smart object, if I double click on this little icon right here, it's going to open up the details or the data that is in that layer. So if I want to replace this very quickly with the good cabin, I'll just drag and drop that good cabin onto this image. And then after I commit to that and press X, it's going to say, hey, do you want to save the changes? And I'm going to say yes. Now, once I save those changes, it's going to put it exactly where that other cabin was. Okay, so we can turn off this layer on this cabin. We don't need that anymore. Now, you'll see that here we have an opposite problem, don't we? Where the 1024 by 1024 is not our limitation anymore. And in actuality, this looks a lot more detailed and real than our original image, which is complete opposite of what we usually get when we use Generative Fill. So what I'm going to do here on this layer is I'm going to go to Select and then go to Subject. So once I select the subject on here, all I need to do is then hit the Mask button. And now we have this cabin on our layer here, and it almost looks really good. So the only real problem is it's in really high detail, so that's easy enough to fix. We'll click on the layer itself, go to Filter, go to Blur, and go to Gaussian Blur, and we are going to blur this to the point where it starts to fit into our location here. Probably about 1 pixel. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, what I could also do to make this fit a little bit better is go onto the mask itself, be from my brush tool, and then use a feathered kind of brush here to brush away with black along that edge there. So it looks like it just kind of blends in with some of the other details that are within the image, okay? So that looks actually pretty good. Let's take a look at this image, okay? So we have this, let's get the move tool off there so we can see just our little rustic cabin here versus this image. Oh, too modern. We now have the log cabin, and here I'd be ready to go and process this image, as you see I've done here with a very different looking cabin here. While I love the idea of generative fill, I'm not a huge fan of the implementation right now. As I've said many times before, with high-res imagery, generative fill is not going to produce ideal results. So, in order to work our way around that, this new program Magnific AI does a phenomenal job of taking those horribly rendered generative fill images and making them actually usable for professional work. It is going to require more steps, but this is essentially what we do when we want to build our image and create that beautiful experience for our viewer. And there is nothing wrong with it. In my personal opinion, I'm an artist. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure that I can engage with my viewer in the way that I want them to, based on the vision that I saw while I was there in my head, and not necessarily the reality of what was in front of me. If you're interested in the 2 other videos I have about generative fill, I'll put them right here at this end screen. They'll also be in the description below. And if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing. I like to take difficult things in Photoshop and make them seemingly simple so you can use them in your workflow today.